In 1930, the SS Morro Castle set a speed record, crossing from New York to Havana in just 58 hours. 4 years later, she burned to a hollow shell. Captain Wilmot died suddenly hours before the fire. Not the lone arsonist everyone blames, but the untested officer left in command. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that leadership vacuum cost and why almost every safety system failed within minutes. In February 2026, a brand new Singapore cruise ship, the World Legacy, caught fire and killed a crew member. But first, go back to September 7th, 1934, where Captain Wilmot stood on the bridge guiding her north from Havana. He had run that crossing for years, and this one felt like any other. Most of the passengers had spent the week dancing, drinking, and sunbathing without paying him the slightest attention. Everyone who has ever heard of this disaster reaches for the same explanation first. A radio operator named George Rogers set the fire, panicked the crew, and let hundreds die while he played the hero. It is a satisfying story. It has a villain. And it is not a crazy theory. Rogers really did go on years later to plant a bomb and commit murder, so the suspicion is not baseless. But officially, no government investigation ever proved he started this fire. The cause was never legally determined. That explanation is not wrong so much as it is too small, because it lets everyone ignore what was actually broken on this ship long before anyone struck a match. To understand why the Morro Castle even sailed that night, you have to go back almost a century further, to 1841, when a shipping agent named James Otis Ward started forwarding freight between New York and Cuba. It was a small, unglamorous business. Consignments, cargo manifests, sugar and mail moving between two ports. By 1881, it had grown into the New York and Cuba Mail Steamship Company, the oldest steamship line under the American flag, and it built its reputation the boring way: reliability, not spectacle. By 1888, the company had absorbed a rival, the Alexandra Line, and spent the following decades quietly becoming the dominant American operator on the Cuba run. Everyone who watches this documentary assumes the Morro Castle is a cruise ship story. It isn't, not really. She was built with money from the federal government's 1928 Merchant Marine Act, a program designed to keep American shipping alive by subsidizing exactly the kind of vessel the Ward Line needed to carry mail and cargo under a fixed government contract. The glamour, the orchestra, the cocktail bar, all of it was decoration wrapped around a subsidized freight and mail workhorse. The company wasn't really selling vacations. It was selling a government contract with a nightclub attached. And she was built to look like far more than that. At 480 feet long and just over 11,500 gross tons, with an unusually modern turbo-electric engine, she carried roughly 489 passengers and 240 crew in a style meant to rival anything crossing the Atlantic. Nobody who boarded her ever thought to ask what she'd do in an actual emergency. She didn't look like a subsidized cargo contract. She looked like the safest, most modern thing on the water. And in 1930, when she launched from Newport News, that combination was close to unbeatable. Prohibition was still the law of the land, and Havana was 90 miles from Florida and completely legal. A 3-day round trip put a passenger on a ship where drinks were served the moment they stepped past the gangway, in the middle of a depression when almost nothing else in America felt glamorous or affordable at the same time. For a few dollars, a clerk or a school teacher could feel, for 3 days, like they were living someone else's life. It wasn't built for the wealthy. It was built for people who had never expected to take an ocean voyage at all. The ship earned that reputation fast. On her maiden voyage in August 1930, She ran the New York to Havana leg in 58 hours and 40 minutes, a speed record for the route, and for 4 straight years she sailed close to full in an industry where half-empty crossings were normal. Rival lines on the Havana run had to answer with upgrades of their own. Newspapers wrote about her like a floating symbol of what America could still build even while the rest of the economy was on its knees. Investors, regulators, and competing shipping lines all watched her the same way, as proof that a subsidized, party-branded liner could actually work. And that reputation fed on itself. The more the Morro Castle got written up as glamorous and reliable, the more it pressured every other operator on the route to match her or quietly concede the market. For 4 years, this ship wasn't the warning sign. It was the industry's proof of concept. Regulators, rivals, and reporters all studied her schedule and her profits. None of that scrutiny was aimed at her fire doors, her hydrants, or her paint. That is not a small thing. It meant real families planned entire vacations and honeymoons around a schedule built on a government mail contract wrapped in cocktail service. When something works that well for 4 straight years, nobody goes looking for a hidden expiration date. She had cost around $4 million to build, an enormous sum in an economy where bread lines stretched for blocks, and almost every dollar of it had gone into things designed to be seen and touched. Teak paneling, decorative veneer, layer after layer of thick oil paint, an orchestra, a smoking lounge. Nobody was thinking hard about what all of that decoration was actually made of. Nobody was asking what happens to a wooden interior soaked in paint if it ever really caught fire. Other lines on the Havana route couldn't easily match a subsidized flagship, so they matched what they could: price. Airlines were also starting to circle the same route, chasing wealthier travelers with speed instead of glamour. The Ward line leaned harder into its government support and kept fares just low enough to stay full, which meant thin margins dressed up as luxury. Which sounds fine until you realize what it meant in practice: a fixed mail contract, a fleet it had to own and crew and insure and fuel no matter how many passengers showed up, against rivals who could add or drop ships from that same route far more easily. Low fares kept the decks full. They also left almost no financial cushion for anything that wasn't decoration. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They assume the failure started the night of the fire. It didn't. About a month before that crossing, a passenger slipped on a wet section of the promenade deck near a hydrant station and sued the company. Rather than fix the leak, the Ward line's answer was simpler: deactivate a number of those hydrant stations altogether. Around the same time, the automatic tripwires meant to swing the ship's fire doors shut on their own had been disconnected, and there had never really been a serious fire drill for passengers or crew. What drills existed were closer to theater than practice. That sounds like a minor maintenance decision. It wasn't. It was the moment this ship's margin for error went from thin to non-existent, more than 3 weeks before a single spark existed. Then came the night itself, and every weakness the ship was quietly carrying finally met each other at once. Captain Wilmot died suddenly in his cabin hours before the fire. His death was recorded as sudden, severe indigestion, though nobody has ever proven exactly what killed him. Whatever the cause, command of a passenger liner in a building nor'easter with winds pushing 30 miles per hour fell to William Worms, the chief officer, a man who had never run a real shipboard emergency in his career. A fire started in a locker in the ship's writing room where dry cleaning materials were stored. A small, containable fire that should have been controllable on a properly built ship. This one wasn't. The interior paneling was flammable veneer glued over wood, coated in layer after layer of decorative paint, and a gap built into the walls above the bulkheads let flame and smoke bypass the very fire doors meant to seal it in. Within minutes, the fire had somewhere to travel that the ship's designers never should have allowed. Then a flare gun stored directly above the writing room, kept there for emergency signaling, exploded in the heat. The blast blew out windows along that section of the ship, and the wind worms was already fighting to steer through poured straight into the fire, feeding it oxygen it should never have received. Down below, the ship's hydrant system had been designed to run 6 hoses at once. Once crew tried fighting the fire with more lines than that, water pressure collapsed across the entire system, including at hydrant stations that hadn't already been shut off after that lawsuit a month earlier. This wasn't a small oversight. It was infrastructure that had never been enough, made worse by a decision to disable part of what little existed. As the fire spread, it burned through electrical and hydraulic lines running the length of the ship. Steering failed, lights failed, and the radio, the one tool that could have called outside help in minutes rather than hours, went down with everything else, leaving a delayed, single SOS as the only distress call the entire disaster produced. The radio operator on duty that night was George Rogers, the same man later blamed by popular legend for starting the fire itself. What is documented is narrower and, in some ways, stranger. Rogers delayed sending the distress call, and when it finally went out, it was a single transmission, rather than the sustained signal a disaster of this size needed. Whether that delay came from panic, incompetence, or something worse has never been settled by any court or federal investigation. What is certain is that outside help arrived far later than it should have, on a ship that was already losing steering, lighting, and command all at once. By roughly 3:10 in the morning, passengers were waking to a ship going dark, with decks growing too hot to stand on. Only 6 of the ship's 12 lifeboats were ever launched, carrying around 85 people out of a rated capacity of 408, and most of the people in them were crew, not passengers. None of this happened because one system failed. It happened because a leadership vacuum, a building storm, flammable decoration, an exploding flare gun, an undersized hydrant system, and a communications collapse all arrived inside the same 30 minutes. Any one of those alone would have been a bad night. Together, they made survival almost impossible. For the people trapped aboard, the choice became brutally simple: jump or burn. Many jumped into the dark, freezing Atlantic wearing cork life preservers that were never designed for a real evacuation. Preservers that, on impact with the water, broke necks and knocked people unconscious instead of protecting them. The ship herself never sank. She burned down to a blackened, hollow shell and drifted through the night until she ran aground roughly 200 feet off the beach in Asbury Park, New Jersey, directly beside Convention Hall. That is the part that still bothers me. A ship that had just killed well over 100 people came to rest close enough to shore that you could walk out and touch her. And for the next 6 months, that is more or less what happened. Asbury Park, an off-season beach town with empty hotels and shuttered shops, suddenly had a burned ocean liner sitting on its doorstep, and the town turned that wreck into a tourist attraction. Local businesses reopened. Vendors sold postcards and souvenir pennies stamped with the ship's name. Visitors paid roughly a quarter to walk out and view the hull up close, and at least 2 men from Long Island climbed aboard the wreck on dangling ropes to take souvenirs, while bodies were still occasionally washing ashore nearby. For half a year, the wreck of a ship that had killed well over 100 people was, quite literally, the biggest thing to look at on the Jersey shore. The brand survived that spectacle. The ship did not. In March 1935, she was finally towed to Baltimore and scrapped for about $34,000, roughly 1% of what it had cost to build her 5 years earlier. Behind every one of those numbers was somebody's actual life. Dr. S. Joseph Bregstein, a Brooklyn dentist, survived the fire. His 8-year-old son, Mervyn, did not, and his body was never recovered from the water. That is not a statistic. That is a family that boarded a legal, government-backed pleasure cruise and came home with an empty seat at the table. Even the official death toll was never fully settled. The government's own count, 124, sits alongside later estimates closer to 134 and a still higher figure of 137 that circulated in the press. Nobody disputes this was one of the deadliest disasters in American merchant marine history, but a ship this modern still couldn't produce a clean accounting of who was aboard, let alone who survived. More passengers died than crew, largely because the crew reached the lifeboats faster and had at least some sense of the ship's layout, while passengers had never been meaningfully drilled on what to do in an emergency. The people who had paid for the experience were the ones least prepared to survive it. And it wasn't only the people aboard that night who were affected. The Morro Castle had made a Havana crossing, affordable to clerks, teachers, and young families who could never have paid for a transatlantic liner, one of the few genuinely accessible escapes available to ordinary Depression-era Americans. When the disaster happened, it didn't just take lives. It took away a form of affordable travel that working people had come to depend on. Ward line employees, meanwhile, watched a company that had employed them for generations lose its reputation almost overnight, through no fault of their own. Congress didn't let this disappear quietly. A Senate investigation, led by Senator Royal Copeland, dug into exactly what had gone wrong, and its final conclusion is worth sitting with. There was nothing definite in the record to prove exactly what had caused the fire itself. But the report was clear that responsibility rested with what it called the human element, decisions made and safety measures ignored by the people running the ward line. Acting Captain Worms, along with the ship's chief engineer and a ward line vice president, were convicted in 1936 in connection with the disaster. Those convictions were later overturned on appeal. No one ultimately went to prison for what happened that night, but the disaster changed the rules anyway. It became a direct catalyst for the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, which restructured how the American merchant fleet was funded and regulated, and it fed directly into new international fire safety rules for passenger ships, rules that exist because investigators trace this disaster back to flammable interiors and disabled equipment, not an unavoidable accident. For the Ward Line, the damage didn't stop with one ship. Just months later, in January 1935, one of the line's other vessels ran aground near Havana, and days after that, the Ward Line steamer Mohawk sank off the New Jersey coast after a collision, killing roughly 45 of the 163 people aboard. 3 disasters inside half a year on the same company ships made the Ward Line's name radioactive. The company limped on for 2 more decades under a different name, Cuba Mail Line, before finally being liquidated in 1954, not destroyed in a single blow, but worn down until there was nothing left to save. So what actually killed the Morro Castle? Not one villain, and not simple bad luck. It was a subsidized business model with almost no room for error, a month-old decision to disable safety equipment rather than fix it properly. An untested chain of command handed a crisis it had never trained for, and a fire that found every weakness the ship had been hiding under its paint and veneer. Rogers may or may not have started that fire. The record has never settled it. But the reason it killed so many people had almost nothing to do with him and almost everything to do with decisions made by the people running the company. That mechanism didn't die with the Ward line. In February 2026, a Singapore startup called World Cruises watched one of its ships, the World Legacy, catch fire in a lounge and kill a crew member just weeks after that same ship's maiden voyage had already been plagued with power and water failures. A new company chasing a splashy launch on an older, retrofitted vessel is the same story wearing a different decade, prestige outrunning safety maturity. It isn't an isolated case either. In July 2025, a ferry fire in Indonesia killed several people while carrying roughly twice as many passengers as its manifest recorded, an echo of the same weak accounting that made the Morro Castle's own passenger count hard to pin down. And in April 2025, American investigators traced a separate vessel fire back to skipped maintenance, the modern version of deactivating a hydrant station instead of fixing it. None of these are the Morro Castle or the Ward line, but the mechanism repeats. A passenger vessel, a cost pressure, a safety shortcut nobody outside the company can see until it can't be hidden anymore. That's really the uncomfortable part of this whole story. Some transportation systems get protected when they're fragile, propped up, regulated harder, kept alive because society decides they're worth saving. Others are left to run on thin margins until something breaks, and then everyone acts surprised. The Morro Castle was never neglected. She was celebrated, subsidized, and profitable. She still burned because being profitable and being safe were never actually the same requirement, and nobody with the power to fix that noticed until it was too late. By the end of this story, the promise from the beginning holds up. The Morro Castle wasn't destroyed by a mystery. She was destroyed by a leadership vacuum nobody had planned for, and safety systems that had been quietly switched off weeks before a single spark existed. The fire was the trigger. The company built the trap, one cost-saving decision at a time, weeks before anyone knew a trap was needed. The Morro Castle worked beautifully for 4 straight years, right up until the night it didn't. And then New York's pride spent 6 months rotting on a Jersey beach, while tourists paid a quarter just to stand close enough to touch her. If you want the real reason things fail, not the myth, subscribe, because that's what this channel does every week. So tell me, do you think George Rogers is the reason this ship burned, or had the Ward line already made that outcome inevitable weeks earlier, the moment it quietly switched off its own hydrants?